All right, we are back. What is going on, Colt Nation? Welcome back to another episode of Bring the Juice. Your guys, Cody and Derek, back for another one, guys. In today's episode, guys, with training camp right around the corner, we wanted to talk about some players who might be on the roster bubble. We have 3 players in mind that we're going to talk about today. But before we do that, just want to let you guys know this episode is presented by Prize Picks. Be sure to hop over to prizepicks.com today. Use their mobile app or whatever you got to do. Use the code BTJ when you sign up for a $100 deposit match. All right, Derek. So I'll preface this by saying this. There's obviously a ton of players that we could have chosen here, but I think we chose these guys in particular because I don't know, they just kind of stood out amongst the rest when it comes to some players based off of what the Indianapolis Colts did in this offseason and players that maybe some people aren't talking about, but potentially could be guys that could be on the roster bubble that maybe we're not considering. So with that being said, let's hop into the first guy, and that is former draft pick for the Indianapolis Colts back in the 2020 draft. That is Danny Pinter, the offensive guard / center for the Indianapolis Colts. Why Danny Pinter, you might ask? Well, when you look at it, number one, he's coming off a serious injury last year. Number two, you look at his replacement last year in Wesley French, who I think played very, very well. And number three, you just added another center in the draft in Tanner Bortolini and potentially another guy in Matt Gonzalez who could play interior as well. So when it comes to Danny Pinter, it may just be a numbers game for him, you know? He's obviously going to have a strong impression at training camp and in the preseason to prove that he's a guy long-term that can be a part of this team as a depth piece. What are your thoughts, Derek, when it comes to Danny Pinter, and could he potentially be on the roster bubble? What are your thoughts on him?
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting spot now because, like you said, when it comes to the draft, you brought in some guys that, could fill some of the holes that Danny Pinter would otherwise be asked to do. And, Danny Pinter, who's still a young player, he was a late round guy and then obviously had an injury that has kept you sidelined. It will definitely be an interesting little tidbit for Danny Pinter to see how he handles it, especially with, like you said, Wesley French has come in and has done some great things at center. And, outside of right guard, Tanner Bortolini, who knows how he does if he becomes the backup guard of the future, then that becomes an issue for Danny Pinter because Danny Pinter is not going to get snaps at tackle. He's just too small for that. Gonzalez would get it over him. Freeland would get it over him. So there's just way too much. There's way too many situations where if Danny Pinter's not careful, you're right, he could be definitely a loss for the Indianapolis Colts. And, you have your starting 5 and you are pretty confident that Bortolini and Gonzalez are going to be some of your key backups. You feel confident that Blake Freeland's going to be a backup for the future. So there's 8 guys right there that this team that's going to probably be on this team going into the year. So there's not a lot of other opportunities here for Danny Pinter, even especially just to make the roster. So, yeah, it's definitely going to be an interesting one, but we'll see how Danny Pinter responds this year after having that injury.
I think it will come down to him or Wesley French, honestly. I really do think that's what it's going to come down to because last year the Colts kept 9 offensive linemen, so it literally will be a battle for that number 9th spot. And maybe Danny Pinter has a little bit of an advantage because he can play guard too. But I know, obviously, I think Wesley French could if he asked him to, but I don't know, man. Like, I see either guy being a viable option for the Indianapolis Colts because both have filled in and played well. But obviously, Wesley French has played well most recently last year when asked to do so. So I'm going to be really intrigued by that. I don't think the Colts keep 10, but if they keep 9, it'll be either Wesley French, I think, or Danny Pinter. So he's definitely got an uphill battle for a guy that I think has an inside track on him right now in Wesley French, coming off of what he did last year. Build that trust of the coaching staff, of the offensive line coach, Tony Sperano Jr., So it'll be interesting to see what happens there when it comes to Danny Pinter, but definitely a guy that is on the roster bubble as it currently stands as that 9th or 10th offensive lineman in the depth chart right now. All right, another guy here that we want to talk about, actually a draft pick this year. This is the only draft pick for the Indianapolis Colts this year. But I think when you kind of look at it, Derek, and you look at the cornerback room, he could potentially be a roster cut type of guy. That's Jalen Simpson, the corner. Now, I don't know, Derek, how you feel about Jalen Simpson. I personally think he will make it, but honestly, I feel like outside of really your top, 3, 4 guys, it's really anybody's game at this point. So I could have thrown Mike Abraham on here pretty easily as well. I think you could interchange either of these two corners for the Indianapolis Colts. But, I mean, they're going to have to compete with, Darrell Baker Jr., who obviously say what you want about him, but he played and he started last year for the Colts on multiple occasions. So they got to compete with him. Amir Speed, another guy who played more special teams, but he's got a lot of physical traits. And, you keep going down the list and you look at it and you're like, man, how many corners are the Colts going to keep? And who's going to be that guy that emerges in training camp and kind of proves that they can be that next man up, if you will, at the cornerback position? So what are your thoughts on Jalen Simpson / Mike Abraham, some of those later round corners the Colts drafted here in this previous draft?
Yeah, for me, when it comes to Jalen Simpson, I think the problem that I see is that Jalen Simpson was not a corner in college. And this is another case of the two Jalens that were drafted this year by the Indianapolis Colts are both being moved from their original positions to, be in a new spot. And who knows what Jalen Simpson's what his role's actually going to be. Again, Carlisle's was a safety that's moving to linebacker, and then Simpson is a safety that's moving to corner just because, he's a little bit smaller. But who knows how he's going to adjust to that. And like you said, say what you want about the Colts cornerback room. I mean, Juju Brents, Jalen Jones, and Dallas Flowers are for sure making this roster. So, I mean, that's your top 3 right there.
Anymore.
Who else is gonna end up, being in that sort of loop of players? And who knows if the Indianapolis Colts actually make a move for him or for someone else in the offseason still. Micah Abraham is also there, like you mentioned. Darrell Baker, again, say what you want about Darrell Baker. Certain players have certain relationships with certain guys in the building, and those oftentimes can get in the way of other things. And Darrell Baker is still a young player. He can still get better. So, I mean, there's really not a lot of opportunity here. And I don't know. I think that's the big question mark for me, is that Simpson is a guy that is not used to playing the position. How does he handle it? He could surprise all of us, but not every person comes into this league playing a new position and figures it out right away. And I'm not sure if Jalen Simpson is the exception to that.
Yeah, and I mean, he does have kind of that tendency to be around the ball, so that definitely is in favor of him. But I mean, yeah, cornerback's one of the hardest positions to play in football, honestly. So that transition might take a little bit of time for a player like Jalen Simpson. So maybe he is a practice squad guy to start out. I'm not sure when it comes to that, but Derek, I'm going to be really interested at that number 5 and number 6 corner position. So the Colts kept 6 corners last year. I'm going to be really interested because, there's a couple guys like we mentioned, that played some snaps last year for the Colts, but also another factor that maybe go against like guys like Jalen Simpson or Mike Abraham is, do they play special teams? Like, are they special teams players? And if they don't contribute on special teams, then, we know how important that is to the Colts, right? How much does that factor in, right? Because we know a guy like Amir Speed, he can play special teams. He played it last year, right? I think we've seen some Darrell Baker special teams. I'm not 100% sure on that, but you know what I mean? Like, that's another factor into the cornerback room, is like, when you're the number 5 and number 6 corner, like, you got to play special teams, or else what use do you really have on the roster at that point, right? So that's going to be something that's really a factor for me when it comes to them, is like, can Jalen Simpson play some special teams for the Colts to start off, like we've seen some of these later draft picks do, right? I mean, we talked about EJ Speed and Zaire Franklin in our linebackers video. They both started out on special teams. So can players like Jalen Simpson, Micah Abraham do that from the jump and potentially earn their way, like those two linebackers did, into more prominent roles, in years 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever. So that's something that I'm going to be interested in for them.
As we said, guys, today's episode is sponsored by Prize Picks. Now, what is Prize Picks? Prize Picks is the largest daily fantasy sports platform in North America. Instead of battling against thousands of other players across platforms, you're basically picking 2 to 6 player stat projections, and you're choosing more or less on those stat projections to be able to watch those winnings roll in. It's very easy. Do you guys want to play along at some of Prize Picks' favorite players like rapper Meek Mill and UFC fighter Sugar Sean O'Malley? Well, if you guys sign up today, you can find the community plays under the promos tab of the app to view the entries of some of the biggest names on the platform and be a part of that as well. You can now win up to 100 times your money on Prize Picks with as little as 4 correct picks. You can turn $10 into $1,000 just like that with NBA, NHL, and college basketball entries today on Prize Picks, America's #1 fantasy sports app. Like a lot of other things, guys, they also offer injury insurance, so your entries stay in play even if one of your players gets injured. So if someone exits the game in the first half and does not return in the second, that player projection won't count against you and the rest of your entry stays live. So it's great bounce back for that one. What I love about the app as well, guys, is it's not just sports like NBA, NHL, football, and tennis, and baseball, and all these other things, but there's also a lot of others that go into it as well. If you like to place entries on video game situations like Call of Duty, CS2, Apex, if that's something that appeals to you, there's a wide variety of sports and video games and everything else that you can place entries on. And I love how expansive it is. Even just looking at the NBA, there's entries you can make with turnovers, with points. You can do combo deals, dunks, field goals attempted, all of these different things. So there's just so many different ways to make money off of these entries. Be sure to download the app today and use code BTJ for a first deposit match up to $100. Again, download the app today and use code BTJ for a first deposit match up to $100. Again, it's sponsored by Prize Picks. Pick more, pick less. It's that easy.
But when it comes to the final player we want to talk about when it comes to the roster bubble, I had 2 players, but I think we settled on one specifically because he was not originally a draft pick for the Indianapolis Colts, but the Colts did bring him back. That is defensive lineman Taven Bryan. Now, obviously, was a former first-round pick of the Jaguars years ago, but has been a journeyman, was clearly a bust with them, and kind of been around different places with Cleveland, and then now was with Indy last year and got re-signed this year. But it wasn't really pretty for Taven Bryan, Derek, last year, trying to fill in when Grover Stewart went down. Really struggled in a lot of ways. But now the Colts signed Raekwon Davis to be that primary one-tech guy to back up Grover. So where does that leave Taven Bryan? Does he slide down to the 3-tech? What happens there? Because we know there are other players on this current Colts roster that can play 3-tech if they need to. So, what is that? Where does that leave him, right? And is he going to have any competition from potentially somebody that slides inside, or even Eric Johnson or somebody else on the roster? What are your thoughts on Taven Bryan?
Yeah, I mean, we talked a lot this offseason, about Taven Bryan, who, was brought in last year to be one of those replacements for Grover Stewart in passing down situations because, Taven Bryan had, I would say, just better wrecking ability when it came to the inside. Maybe he's like a wild card sort of player in that regard. Was never really going to be a high sack guy, but felt like it could cause some damage. But that just never really ended up happening. I mean, Grover Stewart still had a better pass rush efficiency rating than Taven Bryan did, and you brought him in here for that specific reason. So again, I was shocked that Taven Bryan was even brought back in the first place, because I was like, I thought that there was no way that you were going to bring this guy back in here to try and, have a resurgence that I just don't think is going to happen. I just feel like this unit is too deep in a lot of different areas. I know there's a lot of players that are not going to make this roster with this group because there's just so many of them. But Taven Bryan, especially, I think can be a guy that's on that roster bubble because, again, here you would also cut him on the chance that, you could save a little bit of money off of that. So I don't know. I just don't see a scenario where Taven Bryan makes it through all of training camp. I really don't.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised at all if he's a cut before the final 53-man roster. No doubt about that. Definitely been a disappointment for the Colts, and obviously for a lot of teams that signed him. So that's going to be an interesting one to see kind of who is that backup 3-tech, though. I'm very intrigued about that. But, guys, that'll do it. Let us know your thoughts here on the Indianapolis Colts and these 3 players that we have on the roster bubble, players that maybe we're not talking about. Who are some guys that you think maybe might be on the roster bubble as well? Like I said, there's tons of guys we probably could have mentioned as well on this list. But, guys, let us know your thoughts in the comments down below. That'll do it for this one, guys. Thanks so much for tuning in. And as always, go Colts.